When AAA game companies, and all Fortune 500 companies for that matter, behave in ways that suggest that they are absolutely obsessed with profit regardless of who they may hurt or step on to get it, it's easy for us, the working class, to see those corporations and executives who run them as nothing more than soulless, greedy monsters who don't even see their customers as human beings with feelings and rights, but rather just as cattle to milk more profits from, and they will never have enough profit. No matter how many millions, and in some cases literal billions, they make each year, they will always want more. Given the way these mega corporations are often portrayed by less wealthy individuals, it's easy to see millionaires and billionaires as people who have become so addicted to money for its own sake that they eventually lose sight of their passion and begin pursuing money like a drug addict pursues his narcotic of choice. But today, I hope to show at least a few of you that it may not be that simple. What's up guys, Acerthorn here and welcome to another discussion video. I do these discussion videos on a regular basis, so if you'd like to see more of them, hit that subscribe button to stay notified. Now, I should emphasize that the extenuating circumstance that I am about to discuss is not the only extenuating circumstance out there. This video is not designed to make you understand exactly how publicly traded companies work. It would take studying for years at a university and getting a PhD in economics to fully understand that. Rather, the goal of this video is to hopefully convince some of you to give corporations at least 0.01% benefit of the doubt and accept the possibility that maybe, just maybe, the world isn't always going to be as simple as we sometimes would like it to be. Now, even if you do not believe that corporations and their shareholders should be allowed to squeeze literally every single dime that they possibly can out of every single one of their customers, even if you do not believe that shareholders deserve absolutely astronomical profits, surely you accept that shareholders deserve some profits, right? Surely you accept that their bottom line deserves to be in the black rather than in the red, right? If you do not agree with that sentiment and believe that shareholders should lose money to keep unprofitable corporations afloat, then I highly recommend you stop watching this video now because I will not attempt to change your mind on that issue today. Now let's take a minute and put ourselves in the shoes of the shareholders of these AAA game companies. Let's pretend for a minute that we want to buy stock in that company so we can share in its profits. The primary means through which shareholders share in a corporation's profits is known as dividends, also known as diluted earnings per share. A dividend is when a corporation, usually once every quarter year, takes its profits up to that point, divides those profits by the number of shares of stock the company has, and hands that money out to its shareholders according to the number of shares of stock each shareholder owns. See, it's easy to see headlines such as Activision Blizzard pulls in $4 billion in microtransactions alone, and we see such astronomical figures and assume that Activision Blizzard is just a financial glutton for whom all the profits in the world will never satisfy them. However, what so many of us fail to realize, and admittedly, a lot of this is on the news media for failing to remind us of this, is that a corporation's profits are only the numerator in a fraction. And the thing you need to understand about fractions is the numerator can be as large as it wants, but if the denominator is just as big, then the fraction in its entirety is pretty small. For example, the fraction of 2/3 is larger than the fraction of 4,999 over 10,000, despite the former having a much smaller numerator and denominator than the latter. That's the sort of stuff you learn in 5th grade at the latest, but it's something we often neglect to consider when hearing the insane figures that corporations often report. Now, that being said, here's an example to put this in perspective for you. If a corporation earned profits of $250 million in a quarter year, but it has a whopping 1 billion shares of stock, then the dividends for that quarter come out to an astonishing 25 cents per share. Well, gee, suddenly those astronomical profits are appearing far less astronomical, aren't they? Now, some of you might think I'm exaggerating when I give the example of 25 cents per dividend. However, that's actually a surprisingly accurate generalization of how most publicly traded corporations handle their dividends. For example, Electronic Arts, the largest video game company in the world, reported diluted earnings, aka dividends, of 69 cents per share for the fourth quarter of fiscal year 2019, and only $3.33 for all 4 quarters of fiscal year 2019. Bear in mind that this is the largest and most profitable video game company in the whole wide world. If you're looking to invest in the video game industry, your options are only going to get less profitable from here. Now, some of you are reasonably thinking right now, but that's only if you only own one single solitary share of stock. Surely you can increase your earnings if you own more shares, right? And that's true. However, that transitions me to my next point. Before you can partake in a company's profits, you first have to buy shares of stock in that company, because duh! And that opens up a whole new world of problems for investors that corporations are tasked with covering up for. As of the time of this writing, which for the record is 7:39 p.m. in the Central Time Zone on September 3rd, 2019, the cost for a share of stock in Electronic Arts is $94.83 per share. Now, bear in mind that the average dividend per share for the most recent fiscal year is only $3.33 per year. If I were to buy stock in EA at this price, it would take me 28.5 years before I started to turn a profit. Any profit, not just obscene levels of profit, on my stock investment. I've heard of long-term investments, but this is ridiculous. EA is not an isolated incident either. Here is a chart of 12 different Fortune 500 companies, their most recent stock prices, their most recent dividends, and how long it would take to turn a profit on those dividends at those current stock prices. This is very much the norm regarding how publicly traded companies operate. So remember earlier when I asked you to concede that shareholders at least deserve some profit for their investment, even if it's not a 50 quadrillion% markup? Well, considering how much you usually have to pay for a share of stock and how little you get in dividends, there really is only one way shareholders can ever hope to turn a profit on their stock investment in any reasonable amount of time. The dividends you get after you bought the stock must be even bigger than the dividends that were handed out before you bought your stock. It isn't enough that the corporation maintains its current level of profit each year. The profits, and therefore the dividends, have to get bigger, bigger, bigger! This, ladies and gentlemen, is why corporations so often talk about their annual profits in terms of growth rather than profits as a flat number. Growth is what stock traders are primarily interested in. More importantly, the reason the shareholders are primarily concerned with growth and not just profits isn't simply because the shareholders are themselves financial gluttons who can never have enough money. It's because corporate growth, not just profits, is the only way the shareholders can make a profit, any profit at all, for themselves. But even if the corporations manage to grow in the subsequent years, and dividends increase accordingly, that just means that the shares of stock themselves will subsequently be considered more valuable than they were previously. While some shareholders may be enjoying the dividends that will give them a profit in a reasonable amount of time, still other shareholders will be more interested in turning around and selling those shares of stock for a much more immediate turnaround, seeing as they're worth more now than they were worth when they bought them. This means that there will be a new influx of shareholders who are in the same rut that the old shareholders were in, where if dividends continue the way they are, they will probably have grandchildren before they ever see any profit from them. So the corporations must continue to get more profits than before in order for a new generation of shareholders to either turn a profit from the dividends in a reasonable amount of time or be able to sell their shares at a markup. The cycle continues indefinitely. Unfortunately, while constant, never-ending growth may be expected of corporations, shareholders are unfortunately expecting the impossible. Eventually, it gets to a point where corporations get so profitable that they eventually reach a plateau on their own profits. After they've plateaued out, shareholders will still be demanding more growth, and at some point the only way to continue growing after that is by engaging in some, well, morally questionable activity. Now, I say all of that in order to say this. The current video game trend of gravitating to having microtransactions and even loot boxes in your games because they just want to make more profits isn't really the fault of the video game industry. In fact, this sort of unethical corporate behavior isn't even really the fault of the corporations who engage in the unethical behavior. They are just as much the victims of circumstance as you are. Corporations exist in a different world than us working class, and that world operates under a kill or be killed climate. The corporations are no more evil than the supposedly ruthless protagonists in post-apocalyptic fiction. They're just trying to survive in a world where survival is a constant struggle. If we truly want to put an end to what the working class often describes as corporate greed, we shouldn't be blaming the corporations themselves. We should instead be focusing our efforts on reforming the stock exchange that the corporations exist in, whether they like it or not. However, that's not a very easy problem to fix. The simplest solution that most of you have probably already thought of is to start trading stocks at prices where the dividends can start paying off in a reasonable time frame. But how reasonable is it to make that change exactly? Remember that EA's dividends for fiscal year 2019 were a measly $3.33 per share. So in order to turn a profit after, let's say, 5 years, the price for stock would have to go down to a maximum of $16.65 per share. That's an 82.4% reduction in price right there. We actually have a term for a price reduction that massive. Perhaps you've heard of it before. It's called a market crash, and it is the exact opposite of a good thing. I mean, while it sounds great on paper for those of us who will be buying shares of stock after this change is implemented, imagine announcing this change to the existing shareholders. Okay, you guys are all going to take an 82% or greater dip in your net worth and not get anything in return just so corporations can maybe start appealing to some people's senses of morality.
You serious?
The bottom line is that nobody has the right to force you to sell your stock, or any of your possessions for that matter, for a penny less than what you, personally, are willing to charge for it. Shares of stock in a publicly traded company may be sold at a stock exchange, but that stock exchange is merely a mediator. If you own any shares of stock, only you can decide when to even put it up for sale at all, and only you can decide how much money you will accept before you're willing to part with it. See, that's called capitalism, and it has served our economy well for centuries. When somebody sells a share of stock in EA for $94, then that means that somebody else was willing to buy the EA stock for $94. The buyer paid that much for the share of stock, Because he obviously felt that the stock was worth that much. So, what gives you the right to step in and block this completely voluntary transaction just because transactions like that could be one of the many catalysts for a very long line of dominoes to be knocked down that would eventually lead to vaguely defined acts of corporate greed at some unspecified time in the future? What gives you that right? So in conclusion, corporations behave the way they do as money-grubbing monoliths because they literally have to. It's a sad side effect of the way publicly traded corporations were set up in the 19th century. Corporations will not and cannot become content with their existing profits until the shareholders themselves become equally content with their existing dividends. But shareholders literally cannot afford to be content with existing dividends because they will never turn a profit on their stock investment in a reasonable amount of time unless dividends continue to get bigger. It's not that shareholders are just greedy bastards who don't want to be content, they literally cannot be content. When we're on the outside looking in, it's easy for us to blame the problem on mere greed and lack of human empathy. But I hope that today I have given you just a small glimpse into the very different world that corporations live in, and hopefully have instilled in you a desire to give them just the slightest benefit of the doubt, because maybe, just maybe, it might not be their fault. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Acer Thorn out. Peace!